Welcome to Kingdom Reflections. I'm your host, Wiley Edwards, and today's podcast is going to be a little bit different. Periodically, we want to take some time to discuss what we consider to be major issues in our culture, and we want to address them through a biblical framework. And one topic that attracts a lot of passion is the debate around abortion, and then other issues surrounding reproduction. And so, in our discussion today, we want to get a fuller understanding of what that means, both from a medical perspective, and then also we want to try to understand it through a theological understanding. And the goal really is for us to be able to hold up a position that's faithful to Scripture, to be able to understand the issue, and then after understanding the issue, allow Scripture to be the filter through which we form our position. And to do that, I've invited two people that are really close to me. One is my dad right here. He's Dr. Harvey Edwards III. He's worked in the field of OBGYN for 44 years, still practices part-time in OR, and throughout his career he's done a lot of work advocating for the pro-life position, and part of that includes being the medical director of Save a Life for how many years?
Over 20.
Over 20 years. Also a member of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYN. So you got a lot of experience in the issue, and so we're excited to have you. And then the other guest today is my brother Harvey, who's also Dr. Harvey Edwards IV. I'm a little outranked here at this podcast, but he's a pastor at Anchor Church in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Master's degree from Dallas Theological Seminary, doctorate from Southern University, and the doctorate's in what?
Biblical theology.
Biblical theology, and then his master's in counseling. So hey, I want to thank you guys for joining us. I think it'd be good from the start for us kind of just for the clarity that all of us are all three very much pro-life, and I think we have really good reasons for why we are that way. But before we get into the specific issue that we're going to be talking about today, the pro-life movement and the issue of abortion, let's get to know a little bit about us. So, Dad, you are recently partly retired, right? But tell us about what drew you to the field of OBGYN, and did you always grow up wanting to be a doctor?
Yeah, okay, yeah. No, as you know, your granddad, my father, was a builder, and I always enjoyed working in the building trade, and he was wise in letting me do different jobs in it. And about the time I got to college, I naturally assumed I would go into the construction industry, but he began to put me in more of a supervisory role, and I realized then that wasn't exactly, I wasn't suited for that very well. And so began to think about other things to do, and I was becoming increasingly aware of God's call on me to utilize what things were natural to me vocationally, and I began to think I wanted to be in some sort of helping profession, and I thought a lot about going into counseling. And then I had a college Sunday school teacher who was an ophthalmologist who suggested I ought to consider going into medicine, and then I thought, well, maybe psychiatry would be a good way to combine those, and so I began to think about going to medical school with the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. And then, as is so often the case, as I got into medical school, looking back, I can see in retrospect how the Lord was leading me into the field that I eventually ended up in, which was obstetrics and gynecology. So my wife and I and my sisters were all in the childbearing years as I started medical school, and I got really interested in OBGYN. And it happened that UAB Medical School had a residency associated with it, which was really well thought of, and I really enjoyed that rotation. And so I kind of gradually got channeled in that direction.
Yeah. So when you said Papaw, so this is my granddad, obviously, when he puts you in position over the company supervisory role, I think I've heard you tell me this. At what age were you telling construction men what they were supposed to be?
Yeah, I was like 19 years old, and he was putting me as the spokesperson of the company, supervising men who were in their 40s and 50s, and That was pretty uncomfortable.
So he threw you into the fire there.
He did. Tell him that wall's never going to do. He's going to tear that down and do it over.
Yeah.
Okay, Dad.
Right.
You say so.
Right. Well, that's awesome, man. So I know you've been, throughout your career, you've been very much pro-life, advocating for the unborn. How has your position, how has your pro-life convictions influence your career in medicine?
Well, I think I was just instinctively pro-life as soon as I began to think about the issue, but it wasn't an issue that was thought about much in the times that I would naturally be forming those sorts of opinions, because it was illegal in the United States, really, in a lot of places, until the Roe versus Wade decision was handed down in 1973.
Okay.
And that was the year I started college, 1973. And so nobody really talked about it much in those days.
Yeah.
But as I finished college and started into medical school, it began to be more and more a topic of controversy. And by the time it was time for me to begin thinking about what I was going to specialize in and begin to interview for residency positions, it had become a polarizing issue.
Mm-hmm.
And as I interviewed at different programs around the country, I even would be asked during the interview whether I would be willing to participate in abortions or not. And if the answer was no, you pretty much would be told, we don't really want you here.
Wow.
And so I was sort of forced into thinking about it and taking a position on it. And it was, once you, at least for me, the combination of a background of knowing a good bit about the Bible, and having a Christian faith that influenced the way I thought about things, gave me a background for a worldview that was consistent with biblical principles. And then studying such things as embryology and learning how a new organism comes to be, it was very easy for me to come to the position that a human being is created at the moment of fertilization, and I could find no justification for disrupting the process of development at any time after that.
Yeah. So you would sit down and interview, and somebody, they would straight up ask you, would you be willing to perform an abortion?
Right.
And then
about half the program, I interviewed at 8 different programs, and about half of them told me that if I would not be willing to do that, please be honest and let them know, because that would increase the burden of work for the other residents, which would not be fair.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think one of the things that you just talked about, how you said from the moment of fertilization, you can't find any justifiable reason for, why anyone would or should perform an abortion.
Yeah, electively.
Yeah. All right. So for my knowledge, help me out there. Elective versus unelective. What's the difference there?
Well, what I would mean when I would say electively perform an abortion would be for non-compelling reasons, and there might be situations in which there was a compelling reason that an ethical argument could be made for an abortion. For instance, if there were significant risk to a mother's life from continuing a pregnancy, or had a pregnancy that was located in the wrong position, such as in the fallopian tube, which had no potential to develop into a live birth and would threaten the mother as it continued to develop.
Right.
Those would be considered indicated abortions.
Yeah. Okay.
Indicated by the threat to life.
Gotcha. Okay. So in a sense, like a pregnancy with a baby that's in the fallopian tube, that pregnancy has no chance of maturing to birth. So
no, it's that happens in about 2% of pregnancies, and they do not result in a live birth.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Harvey, let's get you into the fold here. Tell us about your call to ministry. You're the pastor at Anchor Church. Before that, you're a college pastor at Capstone. What kind of drew you to ministry? What kept you from, you got the same name, going in medicine with Pops here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought a little bit about that. I went so far as to take the MCAT, and then I started following some doctors around, and just thought, I don't know that this is, exactly what I want to do. And I always, I became a believer at a young age, and so I always felt really strongly that, hey, if you're a believer in Jesus, like, you're a minister of the gospel.
Yeah, right.
That's something that
that's good.
Is something that really is an important thing to me. It's part of what's driven,
right?
A lot of why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And a part of that is because when I was growing up, I'd get pinched on the cheek at church. I was there every time the church door was open.
Right.
And they'd be like, "You're gonna be such a good little pastor."
Yeah.
And but then I got a little frustrated with that because I didn't have a whole lot of strong Christian friends when I was growing up either. And I'd talk about, talking about Jesus, and they'd be like, "I think that's for pastors and missionaries." And I'd be like, "I don't really, I don't really see that in God's word, And so I wanted to just be a minister of the gospel and not be in vocational ministry,
right?
And sometimes we have plans, and maybe God has slightly different plans. So I actually went to seminary to get into counseling.
Yeah.
But part of the reason I went to seminary to do that is because I wanted to study the Bible.
Yeah.
And so, I was in there, I got my LPC, I was working towards that. Just, sometimes you get to doing something and you realize, hey, like, it's not that I'm maybe not gifted in this area of counseling, but I do have a desire to teach and to point people to what God's done for us in Christ, and to help them understand, hey, like, if God's rescued you, He also wants to use you in the process of redemption. That the way that the gospel message goes forward is that believers share it.
That's good stuff.
So that's kind of how I ended up in the position I'm in now. When I first moved back to Tuscaloosa, I was doing college ministry and counseling. Yeah. And then just as time progressed, the Lord kind of shapes your path, and so it wasn't ever necessarily really a conscious, like, I'm going to pursue vocational ministry.
Right. Not necessarily a singular event that you would point to,
but just you start seeing the way the Lord's gifted you, the way the Lord's using you. Yeah. He brought me where I am now. So.
Right. Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is because, as your younger brother, I've been able to see how you think deeply about things and how your opinions, you allow Scripture to be what determines your opinions and shapes your convictions. So I guess maybe speak a little bit to that. How does your faith, we could talk pro-life specifically, but at the same time, generally, how does your faith shape your convictions?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a firm believer that God's revealed Himself to us in His Word. He's revealed, His plans and His purposes. He created us for His plans and purposes. And look, I don't think the Bible spells out everything that's supposed to happen in our lives in this kind of way. But I do think, a lot of times we read the Bible wrong. I think we read the Bible and we go looking for like a specific verse that tells us something about, a topic that we're wanting to learn about. And there's plenty of that in the Bible. Yeah. But the Bible is mainly a story of like who God is and what He's doing to redeem a people for Himself. Yeah. And what it looks like for us to be caught up in that story. Yeah. And included in that is the way that we view the world, the way we view things, how things are important, the way we learn to value things the way the Lord values things as we study God's Word. Yeah. And so I think the better we understand who He is, and the way we do that is He's revealed Himself in His Word, right? The better we understand that, the more we understand the actual reality that we're living in.
Right.
And I think the better able we are to navigate those kinds of things.
That's good stuff. Yeah, good stuff. So I guess let's kind of jump right into the pro-life position. You know, I mean, you hear that term a lot, the pro-life position. What is the pro-life position? What is it that? What do you think? What is the pro-life? If you were to put a definition around it, what is the pro-life position?
I guess I would say that human life is special. It's sacred. It's to be protected, and that it should be respected at every stage, from the most vulnerable time, which is when a human life is completely dependent upon its mother, throughout the years of life, and in the second most vulnerable time, which is in the declining years, in which sentience is sometimes lost, and the elderly become dependent upon those younger than them. Mm-hmm. So, you know, a Christian reading of it would say that there's sanctity, that there's you know, that this is life is given by God and should just be taken by God or by His direction, not by the sole will of man.
Well said. Harvey, for you, what?
Similar.
Really
That's a great answer. I think, you know, we're made in the image of God. You know, like there's you know, value to human life. That the Lord is the author of life. That He's the one who's determining. You know, who's meant to determine, I think, what that looks like for us. And so, you know, I think that's part of that whole idea of, I'm talking about like a worldview, like what does the Lord care about, you know, and how can we join Him in that? And I think a big part of that is like Dad was saying, how do we care for the most vulnerable?
Yeah.
And how do we protect life? In those ways. So.
Yeah, that's good. And I think, you know, what you talked about with the pro-life position, it's protecting life, you know, from when it's most vulnerable, which would be, you know, I mean, even at the point of fertilization, all the way to, you know, someone's last days. You know, that valuing of life, you know, is something, obviously, that's so important. But, you know, I think in the Bible we see, you know, the idea of life constantly being held up as a gift from God, you know, a blessing from God. And, you know, I think as God's people, we have to be people that hold up that position of life as well. Right. And I would think that some people would probably agree with us in that statement, but they're still pro-choice. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, I guess what are kind of the counter arguments to that? Does that make sense? What are some of the counter arguments that people put forth? So, I mean, I think I heard it from both of you guys, and my belief as well is that life begins at conception. Life begins at fertilization. So, what are the counter arguments, I guess, from a medical perspective, that life begins at conception? What are other, I guess, times where people put that life begins?
Yeah, that has varied a good bit. The most consequential opinion on that, I think, was handed down in 1973 by the U.S. Supreme Court when the opinion would suggest that human life gained enough independence and value that it deserved protection, and overruled a woman's right to complete autonomy over her own body only at the point at which a fetus, a developing baby, might have a significant chance of survival if separated from the mother.
Okay.
And so that was called viability. And in the years since Roe versus Wade was decided, that has and continues to march back in terms of weeks of gestational age. It was probably in the range of around 28 or 29 weeks in 1973. Now there are instances of survival in the 22-week range, dating from the first day of the woman's last menstrual period, and so that mark of viability has declined, and it's declined in a gradual fashion, which which complicates the actual practical application of that opinion. Others have, over time, have said things such as, life becomes real when quickening occurs, and quickening was just an old term used to describe when a woman first perceived movement in her body.
Okay.
And then others have said, no, it should be at a point of development of the human brain such that pain can be perceived. Others have said, no, it really ought to be earlier than that. It ought to be when we can perceive, cardiac activity within a baby's body. So various arguments for, when a life should be protected have been advanced, and all of them, seek to point to some marker of humanity, and but some people have basically said it's birth. It's birth, and some people, the real question is, when does personhood begin? So some of the more modern arguments have focused on different ways of assigning personhood to a baby. And as recently as this latest presidential election, there are quite a few people who are unwilling to say that personhood begins at any time before actual birth. So that doesn't.
No, I mean,
entirely
all
answer
of
your
that
question.
all of that to me seems so arbitrary. Like, for example, let's take the viability, So the value, I guess if you were to take that argument, and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but take that argument to its extreme, that a person becomes more valuable the more independent that they become, the more, because really, what is viability? If it's, I guess if it's when a baby could survive outside the womb, well, the baby could survive outside the womb with what kind of intervention from people around, like a 2-year-old can't survive on his or her own,
Right.
And so to me, those arguments are very arbitrary. They're not really rooted in anything firm. It seems to be, I don't know, it seems to be kind of set up for.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's rooted in just kind of a pragmatic view of value. That an individual's is based, their value is based upon like what enjoyment they can have, what service they can provide, what, and I think you see a real falling off of value of actual life.
Yeah,
I think when that kind of mentality takes place, and which I think you're seeing not only on the front end, but also like end of life care,
right?
With the whole euthanasia and those kinds of things.
Yeah,
A perfect example of that is my father, your grandfather, who has just turned 98 and who is bedbound, completely dependent upon others to feed him, to bathe him, to turn him, to do everything that he once could do for himself.
Right.
He's completely unable to do anything for himself. And according to the application of some definitions, his life is of no value now, and could be allowed to, he could be allowed to pass from this world and it be completely justifiable. The one thing he does is he does relish a meal.
Yeah.
And when his caretakers feed him, he enjoys that.
Right.
And in my view, his life is sacred and deserves support.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a dangerous thing when we start thinking of life in regards to, what can that person do? What can that person, contribute? I think about theologically, like for us, we can't do anything for God.
Yeah.
That God can't do himself.
Yeah.
And yet God sees us with incredible value, because God is a God who values life. And I think if we are to clearly reflect the nature of God, then we have to approach the life that he's blessed us with the same, the same outlook that, man, that life is valuable because that's a life, that person is alive. And so, for me, those, that argument of viability really kind of misses the mark of, what it truly means to be living, because we would also say that, people with special needs, we would see their lives with incredible value as well. And they may not be able to do as much for themselves as someone else. They may be completely relying upon the care of someone else, but still those people bring great joy, And I think that's what God's blessed us with. Is he's blessed us with life that brings great joy. And even if, I think another one of those arguments, which we'll get to this a little bit later, of the pro-choice arguments of like, well, what's the quality of life for someone if they're born into a bad situation? I think what we see is that even people that are born into bad situations, through the power of God, they have the ability to bring great joy into difficult and tough situations. And so I think there's this, I think we need to hold. That's kind of why we're having this podcast, holding up this value.
I think there's an arrogance to that to think that we somehow know everything, and really all we know is what a finite creature can know.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's an infinite amount of time beyond this life.
Yeah.
And we aren't clued in to any of it other than the base knowledge of, we can be with the Lord or we can be apart from the Lord.
Yeah.
And, the Bible's constantly talking about how the Lord is at work even in these situations, like Genesis, 50, where, Joseph says to his brothers, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good.
Right.
And so I think the idea that we can somehow parse accurately what part of life has value and what part of life doesn't have value, I think is, the height of arrogance, really. Right,
for sure. So, Dad, let's switch to something a little bit more specific here. You spent years delivering babies, and I know where your practice was in Tuscaloosa. There was an abortion clinic that wasn't too far away at that time.
Right.
What kind of interactions? You can be specific if you want. You don't have to get too specific. You don't have to mention names or anything like that. But generally speaking, what kind of interactions have you had? I guess has there ever been really any interactions between, abortion clinics and like hospitals where you served at? Has there ever been any run-ins or any interactions that you've had with doctors who perform abortions?
Yeah. Yeah, I have to be careful because I served as a member of the hospital board, and my role on the board was to chair what was called the Performance Improvement Committee. And in the Performance Improvement Committee, we would be responsible for investigating instances of subpar medical performance by practitioners. And so I would have to examine cases in which women who have had complications from abortions required hospital care. And those occurred, and I was part of investigating them. And many were significant.
Yeah. Man. So if there was a complication from somewhere else, oftentimes, I mean, maybe not oftentimes, but were there times where y'all had to intervene in situations like that?
Yes, there were times in which interventions by other physicians would need to be carried out because at times our local abortion clinic was staffed by a physician who had hospital privileges, but at times the physician in the outlying clinic would not have hospital privileges, and the burden of intervening to correct complications fell on the remainder of the medical staff.
Gotcha. So, I mean, you've had to deal with patients who've had abortions, and you probably had patients who have had abortions in the past that have come to you, who get pregnant again.
Yeah.
What are some of those? Generally speaking, what are some of those things that they have to deal with? Post having had an abortion.
Yeah. I would often see women who had had an abortion or more than one abortion, and the state of mind of them varied quite a bit.
Yeah.
Some would be obviously shameful. They would feel shamefully. Others seemed very cavalier about it, and so I saw the whole range of human responses to that. There were quite a few I saw who were troubled and who remained troubled over the years.
Yeah.
Who very often had regret and mourned over it, and would voluntarily speak to me about that. So there was quite a bit of variation from one woman to the next.
Yeah. So, Harvey, I guess to kind of people make, kind of speaking to that, people make decisions where they feel a lot of regret afterwards. And, thinking about abortion, to me, that would seem to be one of the harder things. If you had you experience conviction over something like that, to me, that would be one of the harder things that people would have to go through because of what a blessing life is, right? And I think a lot of times maybe women who have had abortions and have come to see the issue differently, if they could go back, they wouldn't do it, right? How do you, just generally speaking, how do you counsel someone who has regrets over a past decision? Not even abortion, but just in general, the trauma that people go through. How do you counsel someone who experiences that regret?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard. I think it's a hard part of life. We can't undo certain things. We can't make them right. But I think, that's part of the beauty of the gospel. Part of the beauty of the gospel is that the Lord loves us in the midst our mistakes. You know,
Yeah.
He loved us while we were sinners. Christ died for us, and you know, as long as we're alive, there's always forgiveness available.
Yeah.
And not only forgiveness, but there's also redemption and restoration.
Right.
And I think one of the things that helps people to walk through those things is to recognize, hey, I can be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if I know Jesus, I'm counted as clean.
Yeah.
Right. I don't deserve that. None of us deserve it.
Right.
And then I think to know that the Lord can operate, and like I said earlier, like, you know, turn what we meant for evil for good.
Right.
You know, or maybe we didn't know better, but now I've come to recognize, man, I've done something horrible. You know,
Right.
That the Lord can work through those situations. And so there's a woman in Tuscaloosa that I know who has had an abortion, had one when she was young, then came to see, I've taken the life of my child, and was devastated by that for a while, but has now not only become a very strong voice, you know, for life, but also, man, has walked with so many women who are either on the verge of making that decision or who are have made that decision and, you know, are now regretting that and living with the guilt, and how, you know, the Lord's really blessed her and been so kind to her to be able to redeem something that was, you know, was a sin, was evil, and yet has worked that situation for His glory.
Yeah, man, that's the power of the gospel right there. You know, I for me, I have a tendency to want to fix things that you mess up in the past, and you know, the reality is that you can't fix some things. You know, I mean, there's some things you can go back and ask, you know, for forgiveness for specific people, but like a lot of times when you've done something, you know, the damage is done. You can't undo it. But the beauty of the gospel, to me, you know, when I think about the gospel, is that, man, God has the ability to take the mistakes that you've made in the past, you know, and even though they're broken, they're sinful, He can like bring purpose to your remorse over those things. And so, like, in that instance, to be it for this lady to be able to walk through, you know, that with people who are either considering that or have done that, and to be able to counsel them. You know, I think it's a story of, you know, of what God does in our lives, that He takes our past and our brokenness and, you know, our understanding of what we've been delivered from, and He uses us in, you know, caring for others and witnessing for others and sharing that story. So I think, you know, I think that's one of the encouraging things that we can take away too, is that, like, you're never too far gone for redemption.
Well, I think a lot of times people, you know, particularly in churches, they shy away from talking about these things because, you know, statistically, if you're sitting in church, there are, you know, a decent sized church, there are going to be numerous people who have had an abortion or have been affected by an abortion. And, you know, it's hard to talk about some of those things sometimes. But again, I think that's the beauty of the gospel, is that, you know, that at one point, you know, we were all children of wrath.
Right.
But that the Lord has seen fit to rescue a people for Himself, and that there's grace available for all of us.
Right.
And a grace that redeems, and that you know, we don't live our lives, you know, with that being the defining character, you know, the defining moment of our lives.
We're no longer identified by that event, but we're identified by what Christ has accomplished.
And there's hope, and there's life, and there's blessing, and and there's ways to move forward in that, and I think that's when you talk about somebody who's dealing with trauma or dealing with guilt, the big thing that people need, and I think this is the thing that really makes people resilient, is hope. Mm-hmm. And the gospel provides hope and abundance.
Yeah, the gospel gives us a promise of a future that's not based on our actions, not based on our mistakes, but based on the finished work of Christ.
Yeah, and it's not and I think one of the things that's amazing about it is, I think the way a lot of times people try to deal with things is they try to say, they just cover over it.
Right.
Paper over it.
It's not an ignoring of it.
Yeah, it's like a sticking your head in the sand. And
right.
I mean, the beautiful thing about the gospel is, no, we can look the hard parts of reality right in the face and know that we still have hope in the midst of those.
I think that's one of the things you see in Scripture is that, like, the Bible never shies away from a lot of the really evil that we consider heroes of the faith to have done, and it doesn't gloss over that. Those things are real. Mm-hmm. We are sinners. We have made really bad mistakes, but because of Jesus, we still have a future, and even in our brokenness, he's calling us to his purposes.
And in a way that is, I mean, if you have not experienced that grace, it's shocking.
Right.
I mean, I saw something the other day, and it was a guy who was asking, like, could you be forgiven for this? Could you be forgiven for this?
Right.
What about this person?
Yeah.
And, the other guy's answer was, I mean, if they really trust in Jesus, yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, good stuff. Let's go through a few of the kind of pro-choice arguments, because I think a lot of times some of these slogans that you hear from the pro-choice side, and I think people really do believe this. I don't think they're just trying to weaponize this all the time, right? But I think people really do believe this. But give me the response to some of these statements, and this is for both of y'all, whoever wants to speak to it. But I think one of the ones that you hear all the time is "my body, my choice." Speak to that.
Well, that certainly is consistent with a modern Western view of our lives, isn't it? That we are the owners of our lives, the owners of our bodies, that we have and should have maintain control over them, and that if we choose not to have a child, we should have the ability to interrupt the development of a child, and that personal autonomy is supreme, and that obtains and is justifiable, of course, as long as we define the being in the womb as something other than a person. Mm. Because very few of us would argue that we have a degree of autonomy that would allow us to end the life of another person.
Right.
That's the boundary. We can't.
Yeah.
We can't go beyond that boundary. Everybody else has a right as well, and so that's a valid argument unless one accepts the idea that what is developing inside a woman's body is another person.
Right.
And if you say that it's not a person until some specific stage of development, you need to have pretty sound reason for saying that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think you're at risk of saying, I have the right to end the life of another person for reasons of my own choosing.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
No, yeah. I mean, I think on that. I mean, I think the biblical witness is that, hey, the Lord has a plan. You know, he says to Jeremiah, you know, that before I formed you in the womb, you know, I knew you, and he had a plan for him.
Right.
And you know,
Yeah, that's pretty strong.
Yeah.
If you're a believer, you know, that's a pretty strong statement right there.
Yeah.
You know, in that verse.
Yeah.
Um,
You know, and I think there's all those kinds of things, like, you know, Ephesians 1, you know, it says, you know, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who's blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. I mean, you know, you see the Lord is at work, you know, before he even creates us.
right.
And that he has a plan for his people, and you know, I think that addresses that in a number of ways.
Right.
Number one, you know, that there's not this arbitrary time where somebody becomes
Right.
you know
Person.
a person, and then in addition to that, you know, I just don't think the idea of a radical personal autonomy is consistent with, you know, what the Bible tells us is reality.
That our bodies belong to ourselves.
Right.
You know, our bodies don't belong to ourselves.
Right. I mean,
Our
that's
bodies
at the
belong
heart of
belong to the
rebellion.
Lord.
Right.
Right.
At the heart of rebellion is the Lord gives everything to his people.
Yeah.
And he withholds one thing, and the reason he withholds is if you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll die.
Yeah.
Right. And then the whole idea is when the serpent's whispering to them, they think to themselves, maybe I know better than God what's best for me.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And so it's like, you know, she took the fruit. She saw it was pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom. She took it and she ate. She gave some to her husband who was there with her. And the whole idea is like it's my life.
Yeah. Right.
And that's what's got us in the mess in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. So, I mean, those, great points. And, you know, those passages speak strongly to personhood, like even in the womb and before the womb.
Yeah.
I know, you know, since you've been in practice, there have been significant developments in technology, you know, and I think, you know, from what I've heard from you before and, you know, from what I've read, those advancements in technology really serve to bolster kind of the pro-life position. What are some of those medical advancements now that you did that weren't there when you first started in medicine, that I guess would be, you know, I mean, would serve as a convincing proof of life at that stage?
Well, interestingly, right when your mother and I were beginning a family, she became pregnant and went to her physician. And after her second visit, he said, your uterus has not increased as much in size as it should have. I don't think this is a successful pregnancy. We need to do a D&C, surgical procedure to empty the uterus. And I, by that time, had a very strong pro-life view, and I questioned him, which caused great offense to him, and caused us to end up changing doctors. And we went to another one who said, I'm going to send you over to see a young doctor I know who is now beginning to do ultrasound examinations, and he'll be able to tell you whether you have a living baby or not. I think your other doctor was right, but this way we'll be sure. So that was at the very beginning of our utilization of ultrasound, and it was only being done at UAB, and we were referred there and met a young doctor who later became one of my professors when I did my residency there, and he confirmed that it was not a successful pregnancy. There was no living baby, and a miscarriage occurred. And so that is the most important technology that has been able to show what was formerly hidden, and that is the development of the early embryo, fetus, baby, and has allowed scores, thousands and thousands of women to realize that the terminology is just a blob of tissue is highly misleading.
Yeah.
So using ultrasound, we can now, detect cardiac activity in a baby, from 6 weeks easily on, and see the form of a baby very early in the first trimester, and that has really revolutionized the views of a lot of people who formerly would not have had any strong feelings about abortion.
Well, it's different it's different when you can see your baby, I mean, that is, I remember with our kids, like going in, and I know now they have like the 4D ultrasounds, and like going in and looking at our babies in the 4D, and it's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
There's my child, and like you can almost tell who they look like to do,
Right.
With all this 4D technology. And our sister Elizabeth, she can tell right away. She can tell. She sees the 4D ultrasound and she knows I look just like.
She sees that
just
10
like
week,
Emily, right? Yeah.
She sees that 10-week one and she knows if it's boy
or girl. She goes out on a limb for sure.
I probably shouldn't go any further with that.
So, all right, here's the other one that you hear a lot. And I guess, Dad, you're really kind of qualified, I would say, to speak to this one. But I've heard this on the TV. You hear it from Congress people, from hear it maybe at some of the protests that women are going to die if they can't get abortions. That this mindset of like, if you are pushing for the pro-life movement, in turn you have to be okay with the fact that with what they're saying, the fact that some women will die because they can't get abortions.
Yeah.
Let's talk to that one.
Okay, well, I feel strongly about this because I think it's important for people to understand exactly what truth is, and there's a strong motivation on either side of the argument to embellish one's own position. So I'll start right out hoping to gain the trust of whoever might be watching this to say that pregnancy carries risks to a woman. There's no doubt that pregnancy carries risks, and statistics are kept to measure those risks, and they're rife with potential errors, as Harvey and I were talking about on the way up here. Simple things can lead to large errors. There was just a revision in maternal mortality statistics that was carried out in 2024 that showed that what we were thinking in 2022 was a risk of maternal mortality from carrying pregnancy all the way to birth. We were probably overestimating it by 100%.
Wow.
So the revision put it down so that we now think that in the year 2024 we had approximately 10 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births in our country.
Okay.
We had been thinking it was in the 20s.
Right.
So there are deaths associated with pregnancy. Fortunately, they're very small. In my practice, which is now in its 45th year, with a number of physicians, anywhere from 3 to, at one point we had 8 physicians in our group, we've never had a maternal death.
Wow.
It's uncommon, very uncommon. So level of risk is small overall, but there are women who undergo great risk to have a pregnancy, and I've taken care of a lot of them over the years. For specific women, it certainly is safer to have an abortion than to carry a pregnancy for women with certain conditions. On the other hand, statistics for the risk of abortion are also all over the map. And I do not believe there are any reliable statistics for what the risk is of an abortion, particularly at this time, because between 60 and 70% of abortions now are carried out using medicine rather than a surgical procedure. The medicine is very often obtained and administered by a patient herself, by the woman herself, with no real requirement for meaningful evaluation and follow-up by a physician, and minimal requirement for reporting for adverse events. And so the prospects of getting a realistic evaluation of what the risk of an abortion is to a woman's health or life are slim. And so it's hard to make a comparison, but I think it's worth stating that at least we should say that on a statistical basis in our country, the overall risk of a maternal death from carrying pregnancy through to the end is somewhere in the range of 10 per 100,000 or 1 death per 10,000.
Wow.
So,
and then if you with the pro-life view that the baby who's growing inside of her mother is a life, and 100% of abortions you lose
100%.
Yeah, you lose a life.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a point that is only made by the pro-life side.
Right. Yeah. Another one that and another one that you hear is that some babies who are born into situations of poverty, their quality of life is going to be so bad or so poor that it's a better overall good that they didn't have their life, in a sense. And they won't say that, but maybe if you make these women have babies and they're going to grow up in poverty, or in
the woman's going to be in poverty.
The woman's going to be in poverty, that type of thing. It's going to create a cycle of poverty. And one of the things that Emily and I do is we do foster care, right? And we see children that are born all the time and into trauma or into difficult situations, extreme situations of poverty where they go into care because their mom or dad or both mommy and dad are unable to provide for them financially. Sometimes they're born into abusive households. And one of the things that we've noticed with every kid is that no matter what situation that they come into our house with, yes, there's certainly trauma that affects them deeply, but there's also great opportunities for joy. Joy for the child, and then joy for the people that the child is growing up around. And so when I hear that argument, it's really hard to give any merit to that argument, because of what we've been able to witness kind of firsthand of some of these children are coming from the worst possible situations that you could imagine, yet they're still filled with joy. And I think that's one of the things that you notice about children. I think God made children this way, as I've noticed, is that children, they're deeply affected by things, but they're also extremely resilient. In a sense, they're protected in a supernatural way at a young age. Of hey, we're gonna of the ability to bounce back from hard things. And so, for me and Harvey, maybe you could speak to some of this too, but the idea that someone's life is less valuable because they're being born into a situation that is less than ideal,
Right.
to me, it's hard for me to give a whole lot of merit to that argument.
Right.
But,
Yeah, and I mean, there's all kinds of wrong assumptions in that, just in the sense of, you don't even know where a person's going to end up.
mm-hmm. Right.
And I think we can all think of examples of how things change and all that, but again, it goes back to kind of what we said before, like do we have the right to take somebody's life? Do we have the right to determine when a life is valuable or important, or I just think
right.
And this is, there's a part of our culture that understands that too. As people think through things like, what's it going to look like as we can more and more, mess with genetics and all those kinds of things. There was a movie that came out when I was probably in high school called Gattaca. And, the whole movie was about, hey, you can only progress so far unless you've got these certain genetic things. And at the end of the movie, they gave a list of people who have massively influenced history, who would never have been allowed to live, never been allowed to take place. And, this was way before people were really thinking about very much of that kind of stuff. But I think there is an understanding that I think sometimes when we start thinking about, protecting ourselves, protecting our own self-interest, that when we're not thinking about those things, that we understand, life does have value.
Right.
And I think that's part of God's common grace. And I think where we miss out on some of that is as we're seeking to, that's all until the rubber meets the road for us. I think sometimes it's, when it starts affecting us, then we're tempted to think through things more selfishly, I think.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what's happening there. That there's a selfishness that is overriding, what I think is part of God's common grace to us, that we, at some level, understand that life is important.
Right. That's good. Yeah. I guess just for to kind of help us out as we process this, and what do you think are some of the misconceptions that people have towards the pro-life movement, and then what are some ways that we could not better understand to agree with people from the pro-choice side, because I think we're all very strongly convicted that life begins at conception. But how can we assume the best in people in that regard, right? So I guess it's kind of a twofold question, but we'll start with the second one, with the pro-choice. How do we assume the best in people that we disagree with about a topic that's really, really important, right? And has extremely strong consequences. Because I don't think that everybody who's pro-choice is like selfish, right? I do think there's a misunderstanding, right? But how do we assume the best? How do we address people who are of the differing opinion of us in a way that's helpful?
Yeah. Well, when I first came back to practice in my hometown, I became aware that a lot of people that I knew and thought a lot of and loved and respected didn't really have a position on this. And so for a lot of people, they've just never really had a reason to think about it. And then I guess beyond that, some people, when they maybe begin to have a reason to think about it, didn't really have access to information or knowledge to understand what an embryo is, what a baby is at different stages of development, and they would they would not have the same concept of what a human was. And then there are a lot of people who are highly empathetic, who see the destruction that can occur in somebody's life when when circumstances make them, or when events occur such that a woman becomes pregnant who doesn't want to be pregnant, and they see all their plans, their aspirations being sidetracked, and people are highly empathetic to someone who seem to have so much potential to thrive in all the things that society values, and now they've been, at least for a while, temporarily waylaid or moved into a situation in which they will likely take over the burden of being a single parent without a partner to raise a child. And we all who have children know what a taxing enterprise that is.
No doubt.
To raise a child without the assistance of another.
Right.
And you mentioned earlier about poverty. Statistically, a woman who has a child and does not have a supportive partner has a significant risk of living in poverty. And so I think a lot of people who are pro-choice are sympathetic to that, and they have good intentions, and they they want to prevent that sort of situation from coming to pass.
Right.
I also think that there are people who just are who really are libertarian in philosophy, who feel that they do not have a biblically oriented worldview. They have not yet met Jesus as their Savior, and they believe that that radical personal autonomy is American.
Yeah, the greatest good.
Yeah, they have a utilitarian viewpoint, and they can make a cohesive argument for utilitarianism, and they just haven't found the Lord yet. And so, and then I think there are people who perhaps are Christians, but who are not, who have not been taught and are not in the habit of actually searching the scriptures independently, and they may have been led by clergy within their own particular tradition who have had a different position on that as well.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of reasons why we should be other than disdainful towards people who
Right.
hold a pro-choice position.
Well, I think, and I think, there is that whole section of like, hey, there are those who, don't know. There are those who, I think, like, they don't know the Lord, and then I think, like, but even a step beyond that, I think there are those who, have less than good intentions, but I think even in some of those situations, the Lord can save those people,
Right.
as well. And then I also think it's helpful just to think through, like, hey, what's our role? And the Lord hasn't made us a judge, jury, and executioner of
Right.
judgment.
Yeah.
But rather, we're meant to be proclaimers of truth. And
Right.
and so I think that, that we can do those things in a manner that's, respectable.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
And treat people well, even if even if we're not necessarily given the benefit of the doubt
Yeah.
by others.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So to that, I mean, what are some of the misconceptions that you think some people have towards the pro-life movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think one that comes to mind that I think has become a pretty popular way to attack the pro-life movement is that they really only care about babies being born. And they don't actually care about people's lives. They don't actually care about the woman. They don't actually care about the kid. They just care about having their, point made here or whatever. And, I think that's a giant misconception. I mean, I think, I don't remember any statistics, but there's, I think it was a 2018 Barna study that talked about, Christians for the most part are largely pro-life.
Right.
And how, Christian giving towards needs is far outpaces any other persuasion. And then I think, there are countless, pregnancy centers. There are countless ways that people care for people in those kinds of situations. And so, I mean, that to me is one that sticks out as, that's a real misconception.
Yeah. Adoption and foster care, a lot of those take place in, in Christian homes. So, yeah.
I'd love to speak to that question too, though. As I said, I've been associated with Save a Life Tuscaloosa chapter for over 20 years. I don't know how long, but I would just the idea that those who are in the pro-life movement just want to control women's bodies, or that it's mainly men who want to control women, or these are just busybodies, and these are people who are judgmental and narrow and rigid and not very caring. I just wish it could be known what the people that I see working at Save a Life Tuscaloosa are like. These people are, I would say, almost exclusively Christian. Being Christian, they have a Christian worldview and ethic that is loving. It's loving towards women who are in a circumstance in which they're considering carrying a baby they didn't plan on.
Right.
They're very loving towards the woman who elected to have an abortion and is grieving afterwards, or who has a complication afterwards, or who has ongoing regret. They're loving towards women who are unsupported by a spouse or significant other during their pregnancy. They're loving towards newborns for whom they collect clothing and diapers and everything else. And there's just an atmosphere of deep care and love and giving and volunteerism.
Yeah.
These pregnancy resource centers are they're staffed, overwhelmingly by volunteers.
Right. Yeah.
And they are some of the most loving and giving and empathetic people I know. Every time I hear them portrayed as places in which women are deceived and taken advantage of and all that, it really hurts me.
It's tough to hear. Yeah.
I know the people and have known them for years and years, and they are not like that.
Right, for sure. All right, so talking about volunteers and that kind of stuff, kind of wrapping up our time together, what can people do to be involved in pro-life, push, helping to elevate the pro-life position, and what role does the church play in the pro-life movement?
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as far as the church goes, I think that that there's first and foremost, hey, here's a biblical worldview that helps us to understand
Yeah.
the way the Lord looks at His world. You know, I think there's a big part of that. I think a big part of that is developing a heart for people. And I think the way, part of the way we do that is we see how the Lord cares for people.
Right.
I think that something a church can do is to empower people to use their giftings, help people to understand that. I think that's, again, that's part of the reason I felt called to be in the position I'm in, because so many people think in their minds like, well, what can I offer? And the Bible lays out, hey, the Lord has good works prepared in advance for all of us to do, who are believers.
Right.
And there are going to be people who develop specific hearts for things, and I think helping to connect them to these places, helping to grow that in them. I can think of a particular young lady at our church, who's gotten really involved in those things. I think that part of this is being willing to have discussions like this,
Right.
and being willing to, like I said earlier, sometimes it can be hard to talk about those things because statistically there are people who have dealt with some of those kinds of things, but modeling how to have some of those kind of hard conversations, but also like how to do that with grace, how to love people with grace and truth, and spirit and truth, and to model some of those kinds of things.
Right.
I think there's lots of ways. I mean, you guys can speak better to some of these kinds of things, but there's opportunities for foster care, adoption.
Yeah.
All kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Speak the truth. Don't be wishy-washy. Inform yourself. Search what the scriptures have to say about this. And as Harvey was saying, that it's very easy to find something to do to support the pro-life cause. You can find something. You can just start out calling up your local pregnancy resource center, and then beyond that, doing what you and Emily do, helping care for children who are born into circumstances that are less than ideal. And these things, if they're meaningful, they usually require some effort. They usually require
sacrifice,
volunteering, giving up some time that I really wouldn't want to say giving up, but investing some time that the Lord would lead you to invest, or investing other resources like is required to do foster care and even adoption. There are people that do that who I look at it and I think, what an incredible sacrifice. But then when you talk to them, they don't consider it a sacrifice. They consider it a blessing.
Right.
So I think it's there's a role. If the Lord puts this on your heart, He'll also give you a role. Yeah.
Well, I echo all of that. And guys, I appreciate y'all joining us today for this discussion, and hopefully we'll get to do something like this similar sometime again. But I appreciate y'all coming.
Thanks for asking.
Coming up and hanging out with us, and we hope that people enjoy this episode of Kingdom Reflections, and we'll be back next week.